Great. Good. Welcome, everybody. For those of you who are there's still a lot of food, so for those of you taking food or who haven't yet, please help yourself and keep adjusting the configuration. Our historic home of Wilmer has been occupied, so probably a good pretext for this discussion. A few months ago, I was at a daddy-daughter Shabbat dinner with another friend of mine who's not a single parent. He's just, he and his daughter's mother are separated, and the mother is Ukrainian, Jewish, and my 5-year-old was having a spirited debate with his daughter, who's 8 years old, about whether or not Ukraine is part of Russia. And they were going at it. I wish I was able to film it, because it's not part of Russia. She goes, it is. My mother told me she's Ukrainian and she should know. So there is a geopolitical answer to that question, but there are also very many historic questions that need to be understood in the context of this conflict. Looking around the room, and I may be the youngest person in the room, I can say this for everybody, we haven't, since the Second World War, certainly in Europe, there hasn't been anything, and I would say globally, there hasn't been anything that is this dangerous in terms of coming close to a global escalation. We've had lots of wars, unfortunately. There are wars that take place all the time, and that's been true in history. But when people talk about world wars, they think mostly about the two catastrophic wars in the first half of the 20th century, what was called the Great War, and then World War I after you had World War II, where deaths and casualties were recorded in unprecedented numbers, just unprecedented, staggering numbers. Obviously the Jewish narrative of 6 million who were exterminated is the most familiar to us, but there were tens of millions of civilians who died on both the Axis powers and the Allies, and the numbers were huge in the First World War and magnified in the Second World War. The numbers here are horrible. Nobody really has a sense of it yet, even though this is a much different world where the media is really looking into this. But like all wars, you kind of know how they started, but it's very difficult to figure out how this one's going to end. So I want to do a couple of things today. I want, first of all, to talk about Ukraine, because one thing that defines this war is that it is all taking place in Ukraine. There was an errant missile that fell into Poland, that was contained, and there hasn't really been, there were some shots fired into Russia, but almost the entire conflict, 99 point some percentage of the conflict, has been in Ukraine. So what is Ukraine? Which little girl is right? Is it an independent country or is it part of Russia? So we'll look at the history for a while. Well before it was called Ukraine, the geographic area of Ukraine was first sort of populated in the Western narrative by a Scandinavian prince named Prince Oleg, who came down from Novograd. Novograd is sort of between Moscow and St. Petersburg, quite a bit north, closer to Scandinavia. And he settled a little village that was called Kiev because it was founded by 3 brothers, the oldest being Ki, and a sister, Ludmila. And he turned that into the Principality of Kievan Rus. Kievan Rus constitutes much of what's today's Ukraine, all of what's today's Belarus, and that part of, call it, southwestern Russia. And a culture developed there. And then he was ousted, and 50 years later, another Novograd prince called Prince Vladimir, and he's an important person because a lot of people in the story are named after him. He is considered to be the founder of the modern city of Kiev. And he was the one who established Kievan Rus as a bit of a powerhouse, and most importantly in the narrative, he converted to Christianity. to the Eastern Orthodox version of Christianity, and that was the beginning of Russia as a Christian nation till you had the communists in 1917, 1918, try to expunge religion. So Vladimir and then his son, Yaroslav the Wise, created a pretty powerful kingdom with Kiev as its capital. The word Ukrainian hasn't even been established yet. Its first use comes centuries later, and it means outskirts or border. But it was then repeatedly overrun. After Yaroslav, the Mongols, Budakan took over, and then it was taken over by the Cossacks, by the Tatars, by the Turks, by the Lithuanians and the Poles and the Swedes. Finally, in 1709, in the Battle of Poltava, Peter the Great defeated King Karl XII in 1709, and some people say that Putin now is trying to re-fight, Peter the Great's conflict 300 plus years ago. I don't know what's going on in Putin's head, but now let's talk about the two other Vladimirs. So the history of Ukraine, so Ukraine was never an independent country, and nobody ever talked about Ukraine nationalism until the middle part of the 19th century, when there was a sweeping nationalism across Europe. 1848 is the year people cite mostly. But it was always partitioned and parceled and fought over. And it's a very fertile land. I mean, it's known as Europe's breadbasket, and obviously we read about grain shortages, food shortages, oil seed shortages as a result of this conflict, and the impact that's having on global commodity prices, including on global food prices. But Ukraine wasn't an independent nation, ever, until after the First World War, when it was the battleground for fierce conflicts as part of Russia's own internal revolution. It wasn't a neat revolution. After the First World War, you had the Bolsheviks fighting the Mensheviks, you had the White Army, you had the Red Army. There were multiple armies fighting for this. And what Lenin decided to do is, once he subjugated the Ukrainians, he then made it bigger because he had other fish to fry as he's constituting the USSR. So what he does is he establishes Ukraine SSR. So Ukraine now becomes a country, a considerable country, and yet is immediately integrated into the Soviet Union. So it never really lived to be an independent country. And Stalin thought that there was a population that didn't love Russia enough. There was something called the Holodomor in the 1930s, which was essentially a forced starvation where over 3 million Ukrainians died because Stalin purposefully deprived them of food. And once they died, he then transferred Russian-speaking people into Ukraine in order to make it more Russian. One of the Russian overseers of Ukraine, not Ukrainian, but a Russian, was a man by the name of Nikita Khrushchev. So he was actually pretty well liked by the Ukrainian population. Okay. There you go. This is what they go through every day. Hold on one second. Let me see if I can.
I guess Russia didn't like it.
Yeah, Russia didn't like what I said. Do we have a generator? Hey, is someone coming to turn the lights on? Let me go outside and find out.
Did they just
It's on? Okay, great. So we're talking about Khrushchev. And Khrushchev in 1954 basically took Crimea, which was never necessarily part of Ukraine. It's actually a Russian-speaking, it was a pretty Russian-speaking place then, and it is now to some extent, and gave it to the Ukrainians. And therefore, in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, those were the recognized borders of Ukraine. what was essentially created by Lenin in 1922, which did not include certain western parts of Ukraine. One of the many reasons why the Ukrainians were in the western part, eastern part during the 30s became more and more Russian because Stalin brought a lot of people there. But western part of Ukraine, which used to belong to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was parceled off into, a little bit in what later became Slovakia and Poland after the Second World War. But they were very empathetic to the Nazis, and they were active collaborators with the Nazis because they just hated Stalin more. A lot of it expressed itself, unfortunately, in collaboration with respect to the extermination of Jews. And the Einsatzgruppen during the war killed over 1 million, Ukraine and Belarus together, over a million Jews. More Jews were killed in Ukraine than any other country except for Poland. So more Ukrainian Jews. And population decimated by over 70%. In Poland it was about over 90%. But so this is the new country of Ukraine in 1991, and it establishes independence for the first time. Boris Yeltsin is the president of the new Russia, and the West feels like it won the Cold War. It really does. Bush, the father, was president for a year, and then Clinton comes into the presidency, and they decide to expand NATO and open NATO up to some of the former states of the Soviet Union. NATO dates back to post-World War II, so NATO goes back to the 1940s, where it started first England and France, and then they added Canada and the United States to make it, North Atlantic on, both sides of the Atlantic. Actually, one of the original drafters of the NATO Charter was Lester Pearson. So for those Canadians here in the room, Pearson was a great guy. I mean, he's not just an airport. He was he was the Minister of External Affairs under both William Lyon Mackenzie King and then Louis Saint-Laurent. He later became Prime Minister. He lost to Diefenbaker twice and then beat him. But as Minister of External Affairs, he was really the chief architect of the NATO Charter, and he got the Nobel Peace Prize for suggesting a demilitarized zone in the Sinai Peninsula after the 1956 campaign. So, which when that was breached, obviously that precipitated the Six-Day War. But during which time Pearson was actually Prime Minister. But and then NATO expands. Now NATO has 30 countries, and most of the new countries that have joined NATO over the past 15, 20 years have been countries that were previously under sort of within the Soviet satellite. And Yeltsin was annoyed. He actually told Clinton, this is not necessary, it's not good strategy. I think history has taught us that an attempt to run the world from one capital, meaning having a unipolar world in Washington and not have some sort of balance among great powers, has never worked out very well. And then in 1994, when Yeltsin was still president, they suppressed the Chechen conflict from the Russian perspective successfully. There was a revolt. Chechnya wanted to break away, and they were subjugated militarily with significant casualties. And then over a series of time, there were other countries that tried to break away. 2004, Georgia, and there was a repression, there as well, and all sorts of troubles. And the real prize, though, the thing that really stuck, Putin especially, was Ukraine, because Ukraine did have, obviously, Stalin precipitated that, Lenin had a role in that, but Ukraine did have a significant, particularly in the East, a significant Russian-speaking population. And Putin was on record in 2005 saying that the disintegration of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. Remember, we had 2 world wars, and yet it was the disintegration of the Soviet Union that was the greatest tragedy. So this is something that he has not let go of. I mean, Putin, again, nobody can except for George Bush, the son, who saw his soul when looking in his eyes. Nobody can really know what's in Putin's mind. But he has said things that we can learn from. I mean, he's very much a student of history. He's written articles about this. He's written articles about the fact that Ukraine and Russia are one country. He's written articles about how Russia is vulnerable and once again under the threat of a Western invasion. He writes specifically about Batu Khan, the Mongols who overran Russia in the 13th century, King Karl XII, who overran Russia. This was before the Battle of Poltava in 1709 in the 18th century. And then the two famous attempts that failed, Napoleon in the 19th century and Hitler in the 20th century. So, both of which were designed to conquer Russia, right? Napoleon famously outside of Moscow, his supply lines were cut short and he had to retreat. And obviously we know what happened in Stalingrad and some other major battlefields in World War II. But Putin feels that it is his mission to protect Russian people wherever they live, and only he can do that. And that will give us some insight into why this war started and how it might end. So there were massive signals that Putin was up to stuff. Even as early as the beginning of 2021, he was moving a lot of troops into Russia and Belarus. As far as Putin's concerned, I mean, the only leader, current world leader who's been around longer than Putin is Lukashenko in Minsk, but he's essentially a Putin puppet. So basically building up his armed forces, telling everybody that he's no intention of invading, but it was pretty clear, given what he was saying and given what he was doing, that this was a real threat. And the people who were trying to downplay this a lot were the Ukrainians, right? Because the Ukrainians were looking to become more and more Western. And they asked, by the way, Ukraine and Georgia asked for NATO membership in 2008, and NATO said no. In retrospect, it would probably have been a better idea to integrate them into the EU. I think eventually now they may get both, but it's not clear when and how that's going to happen. But Putin ran to the Beijing Winter Olympics in the beginning of February of 2022, hugs Xi Jinping, they talk about the unbreakable relationship, and then he thought that he had China's back. He certainly underestimated two things. He underestimated the resolve and resilience of the Ukrainian people, and he massively underestimated the opportunity this created for the West to show solidarity and to essentially demonstrate for the first time ever that this NATO Western alliance has a role to play, right? President Trump was very dismissive and derisive of NATO, chastising the Europeans for not paying their fair share. And he had a point. There is a commitment by all NATO members to spend a certain percentage of their GDP on military, and the Europeans have historically massively underspent, either feeling that they don't have to because there's no real threat of a conflict, or because the United States will take care of them in the event that they're wrong. President Macron said just a year earlier that NATO is dead on arrival. And obviously this conflict forced people to wake up and realize that NATO has relevance, and the Western Alliance has relevance. As you would expect, the countries who were previously part of the Soviet bloc were more aware of this than those of us who are a little bit farther afield. But there were various coalitions built around the impending fear of a Russian incursion. So there's a group of 9 countries called the Bucharest 9, right? So it's Romania and Hungary, the 3 Baltics, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Poland. So all of which were formerly part of the previous Iron Curtain, and now we have a new Iron Curtain. And this Iron Curtain is real, and it's not going away anytime soon. Instead of preventing Ukrainian admission into NATO, Putin's invasion immediately precipitated Finland and Sweden, historically non-belligerent neutral countries, applying for membership. And Turkey, in order to become a NATO member, you need unanimous consent of all the other members. Because the commitment is that you have to protect any one of the members if they're attacked. So if I'm a member of NATO and I'm going to have to send my men and women into battle to die to protect another member, I want to be able to have a say as to whether or not that member gets in. So they're trying to block Sweden because something to do with the Kurds. Sweden has been a haven for some Kurds that Erdogan think are a threat to his presidency. But they'll get in. Erdogan will ask for some stuff. They'll give it to him, and Sweden and Finland are likely to become the 31st and 32nd members of NATO. The other 3 Scandinavian countries have been in a long time: Iceland, Denmark, Norway, but they're not the ones who are right on Russia's border. Right? Historically, NATO in Europe was designed to prevent conflicts on the continent, sort of west of Poland in the north, west of Croatia in the south. Since 1991, it's been pretty effective at keeping Germany united so that East Germany doesn't devolve back into the Soviet sphere of influence that it was before the fall of the Soviet Union. So, and it's worked. NATO has worked very well, and now it's working very well again, or better than ever. But is that a good thing? And I don't have the answer to that question. One can ask whether or not we're spending so much money and working so hard to save Ukraine only for it to be destroyed. Because the longer this battle goes on, the more entrenched the parties become, the harder it is for it to end. And it's getting really hard. Here we are, a year and a week into the battle. We've had tens of thousands of military casualties. We've had about 10,000 civilian casualties, which is a lot. It's not the hundreds of thousands that we're talking about. But the human tragedy can be measured in displacement. Ukraine was a country of 44 million people before the war, and close to 10 million people have either left or are internally displaced, or living in other parts of the country than they were living in the beginning of 2022. And that's not like moving from Montreal to Toronto. That's moving from a home that you've lived in for a while, a town that you've lived in for a while, and it's been shelled, and you need to go and live with some cousin that you haven't talked to in years that lives several hundred miles away in order to get some shelter from the bombing. A lot of families obviously divided. The day after the invasion, Zelensky declared martial law, which means conscription of all Ukrainian men between the ages of 18 and 60, and also meaning that they can't leave the country. So some Ukrainians did leave. A lot of Russians have left too. The Aliyah numbers in Israel have spiked in 2022 and 2023 as a result of this war. Obviously, the major increase coming from both those countries. And so if you look at it from, let's say, the West, and we talk a lot about Canada, but the United States is really the key player in this equation. If you look at the money that's gone to Ukraine, the United States has already committed tens of billions of dollars and will likely commit more. The other countries have too. The United States has, I don't want to say dribbled weapons into the Ukraine. It feels like it's giving, Jake Sullivan, who's the National Security Advisor, was on Fareed Zakaria last week, and he was asked a hard question about, you always give Ukrainians what they ask for, but not when they ask for it. So they'll ask for tanks and they'll get them 6 months later. They'll ask for artillery and they'll get it, 3 months later. And the answer that he gave was that the United States is looking carefully at how the conflict is progressing and what are the theaters of battle and what type of equipment would be most effective, right? Whether it's the Stingers, the anti-aircraft, the anti-tank. The Ukrainians have deployed their weapons very effectively. Yes, there are stories of weapons and dollars finding their way into Romania and Hungary and Bulgaria, but for the most part, the process has been as efficient as one could have expected from a country that is notoriously corrupt and with neighbors who are equally well known for things falling off trucks, for what's essentially been a black market economy. Bulgaria, to its credit, has been aggressively providing food and fuel. Poland has absorbed more refugees than any other country, and And they're doing it pretty happily. In other words, the accusation of racism has found its way into the conversation, because when the Syrian conflict displaced almost as many Syrians as the Ukrainian conflict is, Europe was not welcoming. Germany took in several 100,000, and Merkel had a lot of questions to answer, even from her own constituencies, let alone Germans on the far right. Here, countries have really stepped up. You don't see any internal dissent yet. You don't see any Polish politician, Hungarian politician, Bulgarian politician having to explain away why he or she is absorbing so many Ukrainian refugees. A lot of Ukrainians fled to Russia because, as I said earlier, there really hasn't been any fighting in Russia. They speak Russian for the most part, so it's an easier transition, and some of them are Russian speaking. So when Putin feels that he needs to protect the Russian-speaking people, it's similar to what, I'm not saying Putin is Hitler, there hasn't been any genocide yet, but he's a pretty bad guy. And Hitler spoke similarly about the Anschluss when he sort of annexed Austria, and then we went into the Sudetenland. He said, Czechoslovakia is not a coherent country, and the Sudetenland is German-speaking, so that's going to be ours. And the West let him. The West actually let him do all of that stuff until he went into Poland in 1939, a year later. So Putin also, there were sanctions in 2014, but you never saw this. In 2014, it wasn't just the annexation of Crimea, he also went into the Donbass region. I've got some of this geography in my head. I don't know if everybody does, but we tend to know the map of Europe better than we know the map of, say, Africa or Asia, but I'll remind you. So Ukraine sits on the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov in the south. It's got Belarus and Russia to its north. It's got, on the southern western border, it's got Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and then Poland in the north. And it's got Georgia on the eastern side of the Sea of Azov. So the four fronts, the initial incursion from the north, actually it was from Belarus, because it's easier for the Russians to get to Kiev from Belarus. And then you had the northeast when they were to Kharkiv. You had from the east in the Donbass region, the oblasts of Luhansk and Donetsk, and then Mariupol through Crimea on the Black Sea. And that was, from an economic standpoint, the biggest threat. Ukraine is one of the world's largest exporters of grain and food, and it needs the Black Sea to export its stuff to the Mediterranean. The Turks actually control the passage, the Bosphorus Straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And Putin thought correctly that if he's able to block naval passage of Ukraine to the rest of the world, he would basically choke the country economically and it wouldn't be able to do anything. And he came pretty close. They did take Mariupol, which means Ukraine really doesn't have much access to the Sea of Azov anymore. It does have Odessa, which is on the Black Sea. There's 6 countries that have territory along the Black Sea. You've got Bulgaria, Romania, Russia, Turkey is the biggest. What? Yeah, Turkey, right. And 4 of them are, 3 of them are NATO members. Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey. And Russia obviously isn't. And the 2 that wanted to be, Georgia and Ukraine. So imagine how Russia feels. I'm not an apologist for Putin or Russia, but the West could have behaved differently. The West didn't need to expand NATO in 1994, or 1993, when Yeltsin told Clinton, why are you doing this? This is not helpful. This is not the spirit of inclusion that we were hoping for. And the West, that's really the biggest one. If I'm looking at the world through Putin's prism, I'm feeling pretty suffocated by all these NATO members, all of my neighboring countries that are part of an alliance. Article 5 doesn't say that you have to go to war if one country is invaded. It does say that you have to defend that country by whatever means seem just and necessary. So that's interpreted to mean, going to fight for that country. So they're not fighting for Ukraine, but they're providing them massive amounts of weapons. Enough weapons to fight a stalemate against a increasingly decimated Russian army. The Russian army was supposed to go through this massive military upgrade, and we saw what they did in Syria when the Americans pulled out, and they filled that vacuum pretty quickly. They were militarily impressive. Their Air Force was impressive, their ground troops were impressive. They brought relative order to a country that was chaotic for the previous 5 years. And people thought that was part of this very impressive Russian military upgrade. It turned out to be, a house of Potemkin. It's not. Syria obviously was an easier place to fight. The Syrians didn't have the weapons the Ukrainians had before the war started, and they certainly didn't get the weapons that the Ukrainians have been receiving over the past year. And they're not as unified in their resolve, and frankly, they don't have a Zelensky. Zelensky has proven himself to be an unbelievable wartime leader. Unbelievable. We talked about the three Vladimirs, Saint Vladimir, who founded the city of Kiev from Novograd. But then both Zelensky and Putin are named after this patron saint, Vladimir. And Vladimir Zelensky, we know his background. He was a comic, he was an actor, writer. He actually was a character playing the president of Ukraine in a TV series called Servant of the People, and he used that role, talk about life imitating art, to propel himself to the presidency in 2019, and he won over 70% of the vote. And obviously he's pretty Western aligned. He's Jewish, and he always spoke relatively candidly about his Judaism. He actually, because of his skills in the English language, he got a scholarship to go study in Israel. He didn't wind up going. His father didn't want to go to Israel. I guess there was another conflict taking place there at the time. So he studied law but never practiced. And nobody took him seriously. I don't think Putin thought for a second that this actor turned leader would put up any fight. And I don't think the West did as well. One of the most famous lines, and he may or may not have said it, but it'll be attributed to him forever, is in the first days of the war, when the other country said, look, we can get you out of here, we can evacuate you. He said, I need ammunition, I don't need a ride. Right? That's cool. And people heard that, and people saw him. People saw him running to the front, being with his troops, being ubiquitous on Zoom calls in front of world leaders and parliaments and NGOs and dealing with ministers of defense, and just saying the right things, very aggressive in his posture. I know a lot of Jewish people were kind of offended of the way he usurped the Holocaust and made some analogies that seemed a little far-fetched, conveniently rediscovered his Jewish roots and his own Holocaust tragedies in his family, which are real. His great-grandfather and all three of his grandfather's brothers were murdered by the Nazis. So he had that loss in his own family. The way these things were commemorated in the 80s and when he was growing up was de-emphasized. But so he didn't grow up as an active practicing Jew. He married a non-Jew. He baptized both his kids. But he's been extremely effective to the point where if you want an audience with Zelensky today, you got to show up with something. You can't just get a photo op. There needs to be arms or dollars, and he's trying to root out corruption. And to his credit, I'm sure there's still some corruption in the Ukraine. That the dollar amounts are so big that the seductions of hiding a few things are pretty powerful. But he has been, in my opinion, the game changer. I think Zelensky's the difference between 2014 and 2022. Zelensky's the difference between sanctions and tanks and anti-tank missiles and anti-aircraft missiles and tens of billions of dollars. And that number is going to grow because nobody can really end this conflict under the current circumstances. Let's think for a second, how do wars end? Wars end by, decisive victory, unconditional surrender. We saw this with Germany and Japan at the end of World War II. Most wars end through negotiations. And the two things you can negotiate, and there's some overlap between the two, is either an armistice, a ceasefire, or a peace settlement, where you have, doesn't mean you necessarily have to like each other, but you outline terms of peace and non-belligerency where the two warring factions are going to find an accommodation and put aside their weapons and live under different circumstances. None of those scenarios seem plausible right now. Neither side is going to have an outright victory, and the Ukrainians certainly don't have any illusions of going into Russia and conquering the country. They probably don't have the firepower to take back what they're claiming. In other words, for them, the only acceptable outcome of this war, at least that's what they're stating, is not a return to pre-February 2022, but to pre-February 2014. They want Crimea back. And all of the Donbass region, including parts of the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts. So that's not going to happen. And the Russians, it doesn't look like they're, as long as the West is supplying weapons, doesn't look like they're going to be any more effective either. So, what is, looking at the United States, the United States has a very keen interest in this war not lasting very long. It's already lasted over a year. It's already lasted a lot longer than anybody thought it would. But that's because the Ukrainians have demonstrated they're really good at using the stuff that they're being given. They've been given a lot of weapons, but they've been using them extremely effectively. I think everybody's surprised, wait a second. You took back Kharkiv, you pushed the Russians further out in the Donbass, you're on the cusp of maybe taking back Mariupol and getting back your access to the Sea of Azov. That's impressing a lot of people. But these are drops in the bucket. And the Russians, for all of their military incompetence, are building some very, very well fortified trenches along the current battle lines. And, the West is in a bit of a quandary. It's not saying that, it's not behaving that way, but the Ukrainians feel emboldened. I don't think there's any political will in Ukraine to put aside their guns and let the Russians get away with what has been absolute terrorizing brutality. The Russians have been extraordinarily brutal in their comportment during the war. The Ukrainians have tried hard to be more compassionate and humane to the prisoners that they've captured, letting mothers from Russia come and retrieve their sons who were captured. So they're doing a lot of the things. They're motivating the West to step up and do more. But this wonderful alliance I spoke about a few minutes ago, it's not fracturing, but it's framed. You have Poland and Hungary and Bulgaria pointing fingers at France and Germany, which are much richer countries, which a lot more weapons, that are giving Ukraine less, not just less in absolute terms, but even less in not just in relative terms, but also in absolute terms. So now they're being prodded to do more. And this is when the United States saying, Germany never, ever, as one of its sort of commitments following the Second World War, gave ammunition, belligerent ammunition to other countries. It did sell submarines to Israel, but now they're going to deliver tanks to Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainian forces are outnumbered by about 2-1, and there's been a mobilization in Russia, but the Russian soldiers are not motivated. So people think that maybe an outcome of the war is regime change. Putin's not healthy, he's paranoid, his generals are going to get rid of him, the Wagner group is going to oust him. You can't rely on those things. I mean, yes, it's possible, and if the leadership vacuum in a post-Putin Russia was filled by someone or a group that immediately withdrew from Ukraine, I think it'd be a lot easier for the West to ease sanctions, to reintegrate Russia back into the economic world. But the Russians aren't feeling the economic pain yet. The sanctions haven't bitten. The Russian economy actually crept up a little bit last year. It did better than England's. A fractional percent, when England was down a fractional percent, but it's amazing. The Ukrainian economy went down 40%. But for the dollars that they're getting from the West, this country would not survive. It would be a failed state, like Libya, like Syria, like Yemen. It literally would be a failed state, but for the salvation that's coming from the West. The reason why a long war is not in our interest is because, I've heard people gloat about the fact that, we're spending tens of millions of dollars, but that's tens of billions of dollars, but that's, I don't know, 10, 20% of our one year's allocation to military spending. And in that year, we've seen the Russian military lose 50 or 60% of its fighting power. Talk about a former superpower threat being brought to its knees. Well, it's not. Russia still has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And you've heard the expression, don't poke the bear. I have no prediction whether or not they would use it, but the longer this lasts, the more likelihood there would be a conflict between Russia and another NATO state. You know, I mentioned the four that border Ukraine. So that'd be Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania. This could happen. It could start out by an accident, but accidents escalate often. And either in that context or another context, Russia feeling so desperate that it has to look to its nuclear arsenal. And I think Russia understands the consequences. It's been told what the consequences would be, but it's been told what the consequences would be even if it went into Ukraine. And Russian people's lives are not that different, certainly not in Moscow and St. Petersburg. There's food on the shelves. There's movies playing in the theaters. There are cars humming along the streets. The stores are full, and people are buying Russian oil. You know, the NATO alliance has complied with sanctions, but China hasn't, India hasn't, Brazil hasn't, South Africa hasn't, Korea hasn't. Iran is stepped up its strategic alliance with Russia, providing drones and other military equipment. So what this has proven is that there are camps, and it's not Russia against the world. There's a thriving section of the global economy that is still very much actively engaging with Russia. And as a consequence, the misery index on the Russian people, if you're in the more impoverished places where most of the soldiers are being taken from, and they are dying in the thousands and tens of thousands, then of course this is starting you're feeling the pain. But in Putin's major spheres of influence, except for the oligarchs who've had many of their assets seized and accounts frozen, but even that hasn't been completely consistent. So instead of partying in the French Riviera, they'll go find another place to spend their money, and they still have a lot of it. They've been very careful to, put it in so many different offshore accounts and sub-accounts. If you have a few $1 billion, now you're only left with one. That's still a lot of money. So how does this end? I think that this is really a very difficult strategic analysis. And I think that it's the United States that has to play the hand. Yesterday, for the first time since this conflict began, Secretary of State Blinken had a 10-minute repartee with, I guess his counterpart, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. They're in India for a G20 conference, talk about climate change, talk about this. But so normally the G20 issues a common communique. Here, 18 countries, including India and Brazil and South Africa and Indonesia, countries that are doing business with Russia, condemned Russia for the invasion, but obviously Russia didn't sign on to that, and neither did China. China is supporting Russia. And we're mad at the Chinese for supporting Russia because we don't want the Russians to be supported. But if you're looking at it from a global perspective, if we're supporting Ukraine, then China can support Russia. They're not looking at it through a moral prism. It hurts us and helps China for Moscow to be more and more under the thumb of Beijing. But so what did Blinken tell Lavrov? I mean, I'm not guessing. Blinken said what he had to say, and then he gave a press conference telling us what he said. So it was, stop your war in Ukraine, get out of Ukraine, renegotiate the START, the nuclear arms treaty that's expiring in a couple of years, and release Peter Whelan, who's a American that Russians has held prisoner. We negotiated to get Brittany Griner out, but that's squeaky wheel gets the grease. She was a basketball player, and her wife or partner was on the news every day for a couple of months. So she's been released and she's back in, I think she went to the Super Bowl, but Mr. Whelan is still sitting in a Russian prison. So what can the West do? It can, but think about the strategic implications, right? What does Russia want? Russia wants the end of NATO expansion. Russia does not want another major country with 44 million people, many of whom are Russian speaking, being part of an alliance that was created in order to protect the West from the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Russia wants, at the very, very least, Ukrainian neutrality. Russia wants the lifting of sanctions, and Russia wants to hold on to at least the territory that it's already captured and get to keep Crimea. The Ukrainians want all of their territory back, and they want to be integrated into the West, they want to be integrated into NATO, and they want to become members of the EU. So as long as the West keeps supplying weapons to Ukraine, this battle can go on and on and on. There will be massive more casualties, especially as the war goes on. But the Ukrainians seem ready to absorb that. I mean, Ukrainian nationalism has I said it wasn't ever an independent country for any appreciable period of history. It's certainly an independent country right now. And the people fighting for Ukrainian integrity are just as passionate about their Ukrainian identity. It's probably one of the most recognized flags in the entire world as a result of this conflict. Non-Ukrainians have it on their as bumper stickers on their windows, flags, their support Ukraine runs and walks, and it's really galvanized people who are reminded that the world isn't simple, and there is an ideological rift between what's considered to be a more liberal, progressive West and a more authoritarian, autocratic East, and that the battle is being fought in Ukraine. Ukraine is on the front lines. We talked about Israel being that country in the Middle East. The Americans could do something like what they did in Camp David. One of the ways that Israel was convinced to give the Sinai back to Egypt was as a result of a promise that President Carter made to Prime Minister Begin that the United States, which, and we'll talk about it in next week's class, and the last week's class when we talk about the upcoming elections, Democrats, Republicans, but came up with this term qualitative edge. Israel will always have, as long as the Americans can have an influence in the process, and they have for the past 45 years, Israel will maintain a qualitative edge over its adversaries in the Middle East. Obviously, this is a very different story. I don't think that the West can guarantee that Ukraine would have a qualitative edge, but it would be able to arm Ukraine in advance of a next incursion. This would be in the context of a ceasefire or a negotiated peace agreement. But that's difficult, right? How do you have a country where you've guaranteed its neutrality? This is a neutral country, and you're going to weaponize it. So that's a little bit tricky. How do you enable the Russians to go back? How do you enable Putin to go back to his constituency? Yes, he's an autocrat. Yes, he's a dictator, but he cares very much what Russians think of him. And to the extent that there's a result, an outcome here that's destabilizing and would empower people who would like to get rid of him, he obviously is not going to do that. I think Russia sees this as an existential conflict, which is why I can't predict whether or not any nuclear weapons would be used, but we can't sort of blow that possibility out of the equation completely. So again, ceasefires often don't last very long. You'd have to create a demilitarized zone like they did after the Korean conflict. You'd have to, Korea, Vietnam had a DMZ for a while, and then the North took over the whole country. Korea still has had a demilitarized zone since 1953. That war ended with an armistice agreement, and the two countries don't get along. So I think that might be the best that one can expect, the best outcome, having a demilitarized zone. But nobody really wants to negotiate that right now. Zelensky certainly doesn't want to negotiate it. I mean, it's kind of reminiscent of World War I. That war could have ended, the powers were fighting one another to a standoff in 1917, and it didn't look like any party could win. But the Germans were emboldened by the fact that they just made a separate peace with the Russians. They got a lot of territory. They lost that when the final war, armistice was declared a year and a half later. But they felt that now that they didn't have an Eastern Front to contend with, that would change the dynamics on the Western Front. England and France thought, well, the United States is going to come to the war and swing the tide in our favor. They turned out to be right, but many more millions of people died over the ensuing year and a half. And sadly, I think that's likely to be the trajectory in Ukraine too. Because if the West signals that it's going to limit its support for Ukraine, then Dmitry Medvedev, who was the prime minister, then the president, and prime minister again, certainly still a pretty high-ranking Russian official, basically said that Ukraine is a vassal of the United States, but the United States doesn't support its friends for very long. It'll leave its allies hanging dry. And they certainly pounded their chests when they filled the vacuum in the Middle East in 2016, when a lot of countries felt abandoned by the United States. So maybe what the United States can do is they can signal how much aid they're going to give to Ukraine for a period of time, but then it just becomes a waiting game, right? I don't think there's been clear enough communication from the West what it is prepared to do. It's always been episodic. Zelensky's screaming, we need more stuff. The ministers of defense, Matt Milley from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Lloyd Austin and their who's the Secretary of Defense, and their counterparts from so many other countries come. He demands stuff. They give him other things. Then they often give him the stuff that he demanded the last time they were there. But there's no clarity. There's no roadmap. And as a consequence, Putin probably thinks he can wait it out, because the alternative is looking weak. And he can't afford to do that. And Zelensky, certainly given the mindset of Ukraine right now, they feel they can win this. And I'm sure that confidence comes exclusively from their success so far in being able to prime that pump over and over again, the pump of dollars and Western ammunition. But the West is feeling the pinch too, and even here in the United States, I think you're going to see an erosion. You've already seen an erosion of public support, of taxpayer support. The Republicans are going to turn this into an issue in the 2024 election. And people are saying, well, it's not like we don't need any stuff at home. Yes, it's very sad and horrible that these people are dying, but they don't appreciate the geopolitical implications of letting a tyrant get what he wants through military aggression. And I think that's where the United States is reminding itself that if it stands for anything, it stands for a set of values that would stand up to that kind of military aggression. So, I'm not a different version than the ones that you've seen in previous years, but both at the end of last week's talk and at the end of this week's talk, I'm not optimistic. I don't see, there's no happy ending, but nobody trusts anybody. So obviously the Ukrainians aren't going to trust anything the Russians say. Putin is not going to be convinced that my daughter is right and that Ukraine and Russia are separate countries. Zelensky's not going to be convinced that the other girl's right, that Ukraine really is part of Russia. So as a consequence, and I wish they'd have an argument like the two young girls at a Shabbat dinner table, but that's not where this is going. This is going to see a lot more casualties. Putin is going to be more repressive domestically in order to make sure that the opposition is held at bay. He's going to be more aggressive also in touting himself and building up his own popularity through propaganda and showmanship. Zelensky is going to keep doing what he's doing, and the West is going to have to answer some pretty tough questions. Like I said, I think the Western alliance is not fractured, but it's starting to fray a little bit, and it's been galvanized. And Zelensky knows, definitely knows, that if there's any sort of armistice, ceasefire, and it's temporary, then in the next round, it's highly unlikely that he or his successor would see anything close to the level of support that the Ukrainians have been receiving for the past year and a week. So, happy to take questions. Okay. Let's start at this table, right? Yes.
Well, your analysis of Ukraine as a separate country because of history isn't necessarily the way we always view countries in terms of where their population feels they are. The groups, the ethnic groups that are together, that live together, that share some common interests, to form this nation, and a different group forms a different nation.
You're clearly not from Canada, right?
Yes.
You are from Canada?
No, I'm not.
Yeah, you're not. So a Canadian would never say that, unless they're a separatist. So, oh, sorry. The argument here was that I'm looking at countries from a very facile concept of sovereignty and not appreciating enough the ethnic identities that define how people should or historically have been allowed to self-identify. So I forgive the Canadian joke. Look, that actually is the current world order is structured very much around territorial integrity. And the sovereign nations are expected, ideally in a humane way that respects minority rights and cultural differences, to preserve the peace within its own territorial sovereignty. And these incursions or adventures precipitated by the need to protect Russian-speaking people in the Donbass or French-speaking people in Vietnam or Indochina, that's not what most people who accept the sort of current state of world order to include. Yes.
I think that Putin is feeling very strong now because the United States is weakening and fears China. And China will also come into play, giving support to Ukraine, and also with Korea and Japan. And the United States has a bigger problem than this itself.
So is there a question?
Impossible problem.
So the comment, I don't know, there's a question and the comment is the United States, Putin's feeling strong because the United States is weak and Russia's going to get support from China, Korea, and Japan. So all those countries are completely different. It will get some support from China. It already has, and it's likely to get more. Japan will certainly not support Russia. Korea isn't really supporting Russia, but they're not part of the Western alliance against them. Putin is not strong. Putin has been massively weak, and the Russian economy, while I said it hasn't gone down a lot, it will, because one of the things that has taken place is its biggest customer, the European countries that have been buying Russian oil and natural gas for the past 20 years, 30 years, since the North Sea. It's really, the North Sea kind of was tapped out around the same time that the Soviet Union collapsed in the late 80s, early 90s. They've already started finding alternative sources for their energy needs. No, Russia is certainly not feeling strong, and I think they're going to get a little weaker, which is one of the things that I think the Ukrainians in the West is hoping for. I thought maybe that when they had this thrust into areas that Russia initially seized at the beginning of the war, that'd be a good place to negotiate from, because they were in a stronger position than they were in since February 24th, 2022. But unfortunately, you get a lot of what you lost. If you don't get all of what you lost, you feel that the best is yet to come. So even though you feel a little stronger than you were yesterday, you think that tomorrow you're going to be stronger still. And that's one of the critical obstacles is that both sides are probably more optimistic about good outcomes in their favor than they should be. And they're both, I think, appropriately pessimistic about the fragility of any ceasefire or peace that would be negotiated to end the conflict. Yes, you want to do.
Yes, given the nature of the person that Putin is, a bully, a murderer, a former KGB person, a determined person, I don't understand why we still are able, thankfully, to have a government functioning in Kyiv. Why has he, and I'm not inviting this, I'm just puzzled by it, why is he not taken to the air and destroyed the government buildings in Kyiv and basically destroying Kyiv and destroying the possibility of Ukraine existing. I don't understand why he wouldn't do that.
So the question is, why hasn't Putin, who does have the military might to do this, just eradicate the Ukrainian capital and all the people in it? Look, you know, short of exploding a nuclear weapon over Kiev, the way to do that, I mean, you can have a lot of aerial bombardment, and they have. They had it in Kherson, they've had it in Mariupol, they had it in Kiev, they had it in Kharkiv. I mean, there are a lot of cities that they haven't been wiped out, but they've been hit, and they've been hit hard. The Ukrainians have demonstrated that's not going to subdue them. They're not going to surrender. You know, unless you hit them with a Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they're not going to surrender. They're in this to win it. I think that the idea there's some things that Putin hasn't done that do surprise me. It doesn't surprise me that he didn't knock out Kiev the way you've suggested. But you know, Israel spends a lot of time successfully taking out weapons destined for Syria before they get there, and destined for Hezbollah before they get there. The Russians can do that, you know what I mean? These weapons that the West is sending them, they're not going through underground tunnels. The Russians have satellite imagery and intelligence and other ways of knowing where these weapons are. I don't know the answer to that question. I think that, you know, to the extent that these weapons are being transferred in other NATO countries, if they would be bombing a arms shipment going from Bulgaria to Ukraine, then they'd be bombing Bulgaria, and that would be an escalation within it. And once they're already in Ukraine, the Ukrainians have them and they can do what they will with them. But I was expecting to see a little bit more of that. I was expecting to see more bombardment of military targets. I think that Putin, among the many other things I can criticize him for, is disproportionately hitting civilian targets rather than military targets. I'm going to take one from this side and then we'll come back. Yeah.
Taiwan, how come the United States backed off from Ukraine and not send them to Russia, that they're not going to support Taiwan?
So I'm going to interpret you. The question there is, how can the United States consider backing off supporting Ukraine? Because I think that one of the reasons the United States is supporting Ukraine as aggressively as it is to send exactly that signal, because the Chinese are watching. They're watching very carefully. And I think that if there is an erosion of support for Ukraine in this conflict, it will embolden the Chinese, who have equally irredentist nationalistic pretensions over Taiwan. It's a very similar argument, right? They think that you know, when the Kuomintang escaped Mao's China and established their government in Taiwan, I mean, this has been sitting in China's cross since 1949. So Chiang Kai-shek, that was the fellow. But you know, I think that a conflagration between China and Taiwan is inevitable, right? China's not going to let that one go away. The question is, does it happen in our lifetime or our kids' lifetime? That's hopefully the support for Ukraine will delay that conflagration, but it's going to happen. Yes.
So the one thing that you haven't mentioned is the Budapest Memorandum of 1994.
Yeah.
Which really puts to rest the argument between your daughter and her friend.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, I couldn't cover everything, but the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 was where Ukraine and the other Soviet satellites that had nuclear weapons gave them up. And they gave them up in return for protection of their sovereignty, right? Because Russia obviously said, we're not going to be belligerent, we'll protect you, and England and the United States also. So they're not part of NATO, but you definitely could read the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 the way I think the Ukrainians understood it when they signed it, and that is that they weren't going to allow the relinquishment of their nuclear arsenal to make them vulnerable to nuclear power, and maybe this is a tacit way, without mentioning it outright, that the West is fulfilling its responsibilities. Yes.
I think that the world is very strange. After World War II, I think was really decided because Russia became part of our, and they came in from their area and really put an end to Germany. Germany was our enemy. Now Germany is our friend and Russia's our enemy.
Right. So that's interesting. It's true. Russia did have certainly a massive impact on the outcome of World War II. It's celebrated more in Russia than it is here. Obviously, the Cold War colored the prism of history. So, you know, the Russians had their version and the West had its version. But clearly, yeah, Russia was an ally and lost more people and was hit harder by the Germans, and the fiercest fighting took place on the Eastern Front, and what they were able to do in Stalingrad, and they certainly wrought more destruction on the German army than all of the other Allied countries put together. Right now, Germany is a safe haven for a lot of Ukrainians leaving, and Germany is still the largest country and sort of the largest economy in Europe. They don't dominate as much as they did about 10, 15 years ago, but they are, they're clearly a Western ally, and so, you know, the way Germany tilts has an extremely important impact on the strength of this alliance. You had a question? Yeah. Yes.
I wanted to ask, because it is really like unresolved situation, but why wouldn't the West give more weapons and faster? And like General Zaluzhny asked for a certain number of tanks or something else, and he said, I'll finish this war. Why wouldn't West just supply as much more?
So the question is, why isn't the West doing even more? Look, it's a good question. So first of all, the West doesn't have an unlimited number of weapons, right? So the West is providing weapons to Ukraine faster than it can manufacture weapons. So more weapons are coming from Western arsenals than from Western factories. And at some point, the West also has to ask, to what extent do we want this conflict to deplete not only Russian stockpiles, but also many of our own stockpiles? And the answer is they don't really want that. As much as they feel they want to give Zelensky a chance, but they also don't want to provoke Russia too much, which is why I think there's so many internal conflicts and contradictions in this war and in the positioning of the major actors. But clearly what you're suggesting is what Zelensky wants, and what a lot of people in this country want, what a lot of people in the West want. But the decision makers are spending much more time calibrating than they are clarifying. And I think that's a problem. I think at the very least there should be greater clarification, even if the answer is not to send a lot more, but just to keep it at a certain status quo. I think there should be a level of predictability, certainly among the Ukrainians, in terms of what they can expect. Yes.
Yeah, a statement was made, I think, yesterday by a Russian oligarch that Russia is going to run out of money by 2024. And then I'm going to need foreign investors. Do you think it might be somewhat of a fake news or inaccurate news, but it may work from the propaganda point of view to steer better the Russian masses? They are still too attached to Putin.
Yeah.
Because it's a stomach issue.
Yeah. The question is, will Russia run out of money by 2024? Is that fake news? Russia's not running out of money. If you have the Chinese, and if you have the Indians, and you have the Indonesians, and the Brazilians, and the South Koreans, and the South Africans that are willing to buy Russian oil, Russia has more natural resources than any other country in the world, so they have stuff to sell. The only question is, will anybody buy it? And the answer is, yeah, people are buying it. Look, you've got the whole global South, you know, the fragile economies and countries of the world who aren't getting involved in this. They're not voting in favor of UN resolutions. They see this as a Western war, a white war, and they don't want to really get involved in our internecine belligerencies. So I don't want to call it fake news, but the attempt to steer the course of this conflict through economic sanctions has been underwhelming. It hasn't done what it's supposed to do. I'm gonna take, so you're on, I'm gonna take all these questions together because I gotta go. Yes? But it's a question, please. I gotta go in 2 seconds. I don't want to deprive you of that. Just a question.
My question is, because of we have a weak administration here.
Okay.
Russia couldn't put authority to attack Ukraine. It happened in 2014 under Obama, after the debacle happened in Syria, with the Red Line. Obama didn't do anything about Korea. Same thing. Obama and Biden could have done something before. I mean, Putin got troops since October. He had a lot of troops.
Okay, I'm sorry, I know we get along well, but that's why I asked you to ask a question. Is your question whether this administration is too weak to deal with
Well,
Putin?
look at the back of what happened in Afghanistan.
Okay, well, I think that's right. I think that Putin may have thought, because of what happened in Afghanistan, that this administration would step up. But I think, and I'm not taking a position here personally, but I think that Putin was surprised. And I think that a lot of people are surprised that this administration has been so forceful in its response to Putin. I think it's been unequivocal in galvanizing allies as much as it can and doing the exact opposite of what it did in 2014 and the exact opposite of what it did in Afghanistan. And I think Putin is surprised by that, as surprised by that as by anything else. Yes, a question, just a question.
It's a comment and a question.
Hold on, does anybody have a question? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
But then I'll get to you, yes. I'm sorry, I just got in 2 minutes and I want to give people a chance, yes.
Why doesn't Ukraine attack anywhere in Russia instead of being on the defensive? Why can't?
So they did a little bit of that. The question is, why doesn't Ukraine attack Russia? But that changes their sympathetic nature as a recipient of Western aid. The West does not want to give Ukraine stuff to attack Russia. They want to give Ukraine stuff to defend itself. So you're right, from a strategic military standpoint, if they had unlimited weapons in their arsenal, I think that'd be a great idea. Go hit them where it hurts. Hit them in Moscow, hit them in St. Petersburg. Don't hit them in your own home turf. But the reason they're getting the support that they're getting is because they're fighting what's deemed to be exclusively a defensive war. Yes.
I see that the Europeans have not stepped up. The United States has stepped up. I think the Europeans need to step up more.
So they have. They've stepped up much less than the United States, but they've stepped up way more than they ever have in the past. Well, that's right. They have it. Well, yes, but I don't think that if you look at the numbers, I think people are surprised, particularly by countries like Poland and Hungary and Bulgaria, relative to their economies and also in absolute terms, they've stepped up way more than anybody expected. France has underperformed, Germany has underperformed relative to other people who were ponying up, and there's tension there. The United States clearly is doing most of the heavy lifting, but unlike in other instances, it's not doing all of the heavy lifting. You had a question in your question. I'm sorry, Ron. Yes, do you have a question?
I was just thinking along the lines of trying to find a solution. The importance of Crimea to the Russians, I think, is more than the Ukrainians. In the psychology of the Russians, so the Crimean War and
right. Well, yeah, the Crimean War goes back 30 years. But I guess the question is, I think if there is some sort of negotiated accommodation, it could not include a return of Crimea to Ukraine. In other words, unless there's an outright victory by Ukraine or the Western Alliance, I think even if Putin is ousted and a new leader comes in, it would be very difficult for that leader to negotiate anything that would involve the return of Crimea to Ukraine. Your question, please.
Are we going to discuss why the United States, which is something we are having this big conflict as usual with Russia, is using Russia to negotiate this deal they're trying to put through with Iran?
Yeah, so we'll discuss that in the last class, and that's true. It's less so now. It was true at the beginning of the conflict. It was ridiculous then. It would be even more ridiculous now. The good news or bad news, depending on where you come out on it, the question was the renegotiation of the JCPOA, which seemed to be a Biden administration priority when he came into office, Initially, the Iranians were refusing to actually sit with the Americans, and the Americans were put in the relatively humbling or humiliating position to use the Russians as intermediaries, even after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The good news is there's no negotiation. We don't need the Russians, we don't need anybody. The Iranians aren't talking. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.